Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the first community African Energy Futures community event of the year. The idea behind these events is to create a live interaction, but also an online repository of useful information for modelers working in Africa, thinking about the challenges of energy and economic modeling. And today, in particular, we're focused on the issue of demand side modeling. And so we tend to be much more practiced, and there's less risk and less nuance on the supply side. But the demand side is really quite challenging. And so we've got three excellent speakers today to help us at least sort of think through some of this. And I would also really like to introduce Rose Mutiso, who is sort of chairs the African Energy Futures Advisory Board, who's going to facilitate for us today, and she will sort of introduce the speakers as they come. So welcome everybody, and we're really excited to be in discussions with you. And thanks, Rose. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve. So because one of our speakers has a hard stop, has to get on a plane, we'll jump right into the first speaker, who I'll introduce shortly, and then we'll continue the rest of the program. But before I do that, I just wanted to note that you'll notice our entire panel today is purposefully we don't have any African modelers on this panel, which might seem strange for the African Energy Futures Lab. Part of the rationale is we have an active bid going on, and many of the African modelers are part of that bid. And so for neutrality, we decided to just focus the conversation on our excellent kind of global collaborators. Whereas in under usual practice, we would mix it up or, have an Africa focused panel. But this time we really want to make sure that we're not giving any African modeler more visibility than another. So that's the reason. So, okay, very quickly, I'd just like to introduce our first speaker, who, as I said, has to run quite shortly. This is Ketan Ahuja, who is from the Harvard Growth Lab. And he does really interesting work around industrialization pathways, especially in emerging economies where there's quite a lot of complexity in trying to build those scenarios and a lot of uncertainty about the possible trajectories. So he builds tools based on trade data and country level capabilities to explore these possible pathways. So Ketan, I will hand it over to you. And thank you for squeezing us in right before your flight.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks so much, Rose. It's a pleasure. So, as Rose mentioned, I lead an agenda at the Growth Lab at Harvard's Kennedy School on green growth. And I'll tell you a little bit about that agenda, and then I'll dive into one of the tools that we produce, which is on green value chains and how places can use green value chains and certain types of analysis to form industrial policy around economic opportunities they have. So our green growth agenda at the Growth Lab is all about how places can generate economic growth from the energy transition by helping the world to decarbonize. So we help places think about how to be on the production of industries that the world is going to need, and as the energy transition goes on, we're obviously going to need a lot more of certain types of stuff like solar panels and batteries and EVs, and also things like green hydrogen or green steel, and green ammonia, and also things like carbon credits. So we've split our agenda into five different pillars of research. And one of the pillars is around manufacturing in green value chains, how places can think about how they can develop manufacturing in green value chains. And we also do work on what's come to be known as power shoring, which is where places develop energy intensive industries using their renewable energy resources. And that's something that we've been doing a fair bit more of recently. So, and then we also do some work on carbon credits. So, making and selling carbon credits is a good opportunity for lots of places with natural carbon sinks, or the ability to develop carbon sinks. And then our fourth pillar is all around kind of services and innovation in the energy transition. So the first three ways to monetize activities in the energy transition all involve putting work into a physical product or a carbon credit and then selling that. But along the way to doing that, places are going to develop a lot of know-how in industries that the world needs to decarbonize. So we help them think about how they can monetize that know-how directly by creating services businesses and or intellectual property or conducting innovation in these spaces. And then our last pillar is really thinking about how these green industries can change a place's pathway or opportunities for industrialization. So thinking about um, how developing an industry in a green area can bring new capabilities to a place that can make the place's economy more complex, and how those capabilities can then be used as stepping stones to meaningfully change the trajectory of growth and development that a place has available to it. So we have this diverse research agenda across these five pillars. We've worked on these topics in academic research, but also mostly in policy research, where we work directly with places. And we've worked in Africa, we've worked in South Africa and in Namibia, and in Morocco, and a little bit in Ethiopia on these topics. Um, and then we do executive education, and then we also build digital tools, as Rose and Steve mentioned. So I'm going to dive into one of our digital tools and show you how you can use it in modeling around these topics of green growth. So I'm just sharing my screen now. I hope you can see it. Um, this is a tool that we've built over the last year and a half called Greenplexity. And it is really all about packaging our research on the first pillar of what I talked about, which is around how places can develop green industries in value chains to manufacture energy technologies. This is a critical development pathway for many different countries, China's the kind of wonder child here, where something like 40% of China's annual growth comes now from selling energy technologies, which are fast-growing industries. So things like EVs and solar panels and batteries. And China's created many of the industrial leaders in these fields. Um, so this tool is based on a theory we have around economic development, which is something that was created at the Growth Lab by our founder and his collaborators at the time, about 20 years ago, and it's something that has become really a pillar of economic work in growth and development. And this area of research is called economic complexity. So the basic idea behind it is that places tend to diversify into industries that are related to what they already do. And then diversification into more and more industries and into more complex industries drives economic growth. So So we think of economic growth as a process of diversification into more and more complex industries. And the energy transition is a great opportunity for places to leverage these fast-growing new industries to diversify their economies and get into more complex forms of production. So I'll walk you through how this tool can help you in modeling these sorts of issues in your country. Um, and I'm going to use South Africa here as an example. So there's a little tutorial here at the beginning. I'm going to skip it and then I'll explain to you what the tool is about. So the tool maps these 10 different value chains. They're all energy technologies, things like electric vehicles, fuel cells, wind power, the electric grid, batteries. And the tool maps all of the products that go into all of these different technologies. Um, so you have, semiconductors and electric boards and wire and all those sorts of things that go into an EV. Um, And then you have all these circles in dark, which are products that South Africa produced competitively in 2023. And you can change the year, so you can look at trends over time. Um, but basically, everything in dark is something that South Africa has the capabilities to produce, and everything in light is something that South Africa doesn't yet produce competitively. Um, And then we organize these into sets of clusters. So we have about 350 or so products in these industries that we've mapped. And then we have about 35 or so clusters that we've organized these products into. So these are clusters are like subsets of products that make sense to produce together. They all clusters involve very highly related shared capabilities and products, it makes sense to co-locate production of these clusters. So the idea is that instead of targeting an entire value chain, which is vertical and contains lots and lots of different types of products, countries should focus on the clusters within these value chains as a whole that make sense for their different forms of production, and then they can produce sets of common inputs and then import what they aren't yet able to produce. And so this is a view of just these clusters for South Africa. So everything in dark is something that South Africa produces, and everything in light is something that South Africa doesn't yet produce competitively. Um, and then we map we map the we map South Africa's trade in all of these different clusters and products. So South Africa is a mining economy. It's very good at minerals and metals and industrial industrial products like minerals, metals, catalysts. Um, and this shows the trade value in in these different clusters within green value chains that South Africa exports. So let's dive into one of these. You can look at catalytic materials, and then you can see how South Africa's exports in this product set breaks down. And it's mostly catalytic materials that relate to these precious metal articles, and then also, I guess, things that get classified as catalytic preparations. So we can look at trade value and we can look at also market share. So, if you wanted to know what share of the global market in metal ores South Africa has, I guess it's around almost 6%. And then it breaks down into these sets of ores, mostly concentrated in these three sets of metal ores that are used in the energy transition. Um, and so you can really see how South Africa's trade breaks down across all of these different clusters. Um, we use that to diagnose what we call a strategic approach for South Africa's industrial policy. This is kind of a complex slide to understand, but basically, it it suggests a general flavor of industrial policy that we think South Africa needs to produce. And that flavor is based on two different criteria. So on the x-axis is South Africa's economic complexity. And what we're looking at here is we're asking um, how 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 complex is South Africa? Is it a complex economy, or is it an economy more geared towards producing commodity things that most places can produce? And then on the y-axis, we ask, is South Africa well connected to industries in this green growth space? And and those two things are very important considerations for industrial strategy. So if growth is a process of diversifying into more and more complex industries, the x-axis kind of says more complex, and the y-axis kind of says what are your prospects for diversifying into more industries. And so then we can suggest a general flavor of industrial policy. So South Africa is kind of on the border of this top right quadrant and top left quadrant. And the top right quadrant means that South Africa it has a lot of complexity, and its economic growth industrial strategy should focus on leveraging that complexity. And then and then the top left quadrant is all about how does South Africa have lots of opportunities nearby in these green value chains to diversify into. And what we think is South Africa is kind of moderately complex, but it could be more complex, and it has some opportunities nearby, but it really needs to get involved in more complex industries. So their industrial policy should focus on diversifying into the opportunities where it can diversify into, and also seeking more complex industries where possible. And then we can break that down into specific sets of clusters that we recommend for South Africa. So we think these clusters are good opportunities based on how feasible they are for South Africa. Are they related to existing industries in South Africa? And then how attractive they are. Are they complex industries that bring new capabilities into South Africa? And the dark blue ones are things we think are good clusters for South Africa to try and target, and the red ones are ones that we think are not quite at the frontier between these two trade-offs. So you can look also at how clusters connect to different value chains and different products. One thing we found in our research is a lot of these industries are very interconnected, and so it makes sense to look at how one cluster can connect your place to lots of different value chains and lots of different products, and focus on kind of areas of overlap in these different sets of industries. And then you can dive into specific products. So let's say South Africa wanted to start developing ion exchangers, and ion exchangers are used in fuel cells. This was something we found in our South Africa project, that fuel cells were a pretty good opportunity for South Africa's industrial base. Then policymakers can look at the product complexity of ion exchangers, how much ion exchangers could increase South Africa's complexity, and then how feasible these products are for South Africa. And then, it's a fast-growing market, and it's not a huge market, but it is growing fast. So you can look at these different opportunities across different dimensions to say, okay, well, it's very complex and it could do a lot for South Africa's economy, but it really requires a big effort to organize the right capabilities around production. And then it's a fast-growing market, so that could be an exciting space to target with industrial policy. And the profile of particular products will look very different across these different dimensions. So, for example, the ion exchanges, much more complex and can do a lot more for South Africa. The polymers themselves, less complex, much more similar to what South Africa already does. Not growing very fast, but it is a very large market. So you'd want to construct an industrial strategy that has a balance of different types of opportunity and product. So then we kind of summarize all of this. And then there are some links that you can explore if you like. We have a newsletter, so you can subscribe for updates if you want to hear more about our research. You can go to our research page. We have another tool called the Atlas of Economic Complexity that provides more detail on trade data in different countries. And then we have an index where you can show countries changing position over time. So just to close it out, I'll look up South Africa. And South Africa is its trajectory has been slightly downward. It's been losing some of its industrial capabilities in this green growth space over the last decade. But this fits its general kind of middling complexity profile. So yeah, this is our tool. Play around with it. I hope you find it useful, and feel free to reach out if you want to have any questions about the tool or about modeling or in general about our green growth research. I'd be very happy to talk to you. All right.
Ketan, thank you so much. It's such a shame you're leaving because like I personally have like 1,000 questions. Just so I also on the side I was also playing around with the resource. So for everyone to know, it's if you just Google Greenplexity, this is publicly available. Could you have time for one question or do you have to run?
Oh, I can take one question.
Okay, so just one is a quick question about whether we'll just send this to you about whether or not you'll be at the mining in Daba. We'll just send that to you. A question I have is, so like when I look at a country like Kenya and how it's breakdown, so it has some local capacities in like, I know, some kind of chemical production, which shows up in some of the clusters, like for panels or EVs. But how do you roll that up into like being able to have meaningful traction in a sector? It's like, what is the kind of minimum viable, all the circles in the cluster, what is a minimal viable footprint you need so that you can kind of aggregate that into into an actual cohesive, like for example, EV manufacturing?
Yeah, I think a couple of ways to think about it. Generally would say a lot of industrial strategists say let's focus on the value chain that you can do, and let's try and develop EV manufacturing. We think that's not the right approach. The right approach is to say, look at all of these value chains together and then focus on common areas where you can be good at. And that may mean that you make the EVs. So, for example, South Africa makes a lot of vehicles. They might want to make EVs, but they should focus on that chemical product as inputs to EVs and as inputs to other things, and then import the rest of what they produce. And then in terms of what's kind of minimum viable product for South Africa, this tool will tell you a lot about what you have, and it'll also tell you about how to go about doing industrial strategy. So this tool might say South Africa has, or whatever country might have, certain capabilities in chemical manufacturing. And if it already exports or if it has adjacencies, if it has existing industries that are related to chemical manufacturing of that specific type, then industrial policy should focus on using those related capabilities, using that know-how that already exists domestically, reaching out to those firms, organizing those firms, encouraging them to move into this adjacent space using their existing know-how. If this analysis says, no, actually, you don't have anything nearby or in this space, then what you need to do is instead import that know-how or bring that know-how into your economy. And then you need to do things like engage in FDI, make more of a strategic bet for something that's quite far away from what you know how to do. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Just as I see you're typing some direct answers just to questions to some direct questions in the Q&A. So thanks for that. But lots of questions on methodology. So before you run off, are your methodologies available on the website, and how can we kind of dig into some of the underlying data? Because I'm sure a lot of the modeling, a lot of our audience are modelers and analysts too. I'm sure they'd love to.
Yeah, they are. So I'll post our page in the chat. I'll post our website in the chat, but all of our methods are publicly available. And so you can just look at our kind of literature and then also reach out if you have any questions.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Safe
Thank
flight.
you.
Thanks for joining us. We'll share with everyone afterwards both the link to the tool that they can play with and the methodology. So, and as more questions comes, we'll share them with you directly. So thanks so much, Ketan. Safe travels.
Great. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right, so now we are proceeding with the rest of our program. As I mentioned, panelist Ketan has to run off. So I'd like to, I guess I didn't do a bit of a framing at the beginning because we were rushing a bit, and I'll just do really quickly. So the reason this webinar is focused on demand side modeling is, as many of you who are in the modeling space would know, this is quite difficult and also neglected. And, you know, first just characterizing current demand already is difficult enough, especially in data scarce places like the African continent, especially where it's rural or unserved demand, or where there's a lot of informal sources of demand. And then also predicting future demand becomes tricky because like a lot of African countries, for example, are starting from a very low baseline. And so do we want to be overambitious and ambitious? How do we find the right spot? So there's also a lot of conversation right now about big bets. You know, we're just, I think, coming out on the other side of hydrogen mania. Now we're in data center mania. Who knows what's coming next? And so there's also a lot of kind of noise around what the future centers of demand will be. And in the meantime, we have poverty, unemployment, and actually kind of the chronic problems that have always been in the background. So trying to kind of look at the demand side of energy, what's happening now, how it's growing, and capturing the particularities of developing and emerging markets is really, really important. So thanks again to Ketan, who had to leave, who is doing this work using trade data and other data to try and identify these sources of green industrialization demand, including some of these buzzy ones like hydrogen. Next, I'd like to turn over to Charlie. So Charlie Heaps is, I'm going to get your introduction here. Yes, so Charlie is at Stockholm Environment Institute, or SEI, as many of you know. And he's a long timer, very, very long timer in this space. Many of you have probably used the tools that he helped develop many years ago. Probably interfaced with him. So, and he's done a lot of kind of work on the continent and done a lot of training, capacity building, and collaboration on the continent. So I'm sure many on this call already are familiar with you. So Charlie will address the necessity of demand side modeling, the common errors made, and introduce us to one of the most popular tools for demand side modeling, Leap, which, as I said, many researchers on the continent use. So Charlie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rose. Hope you can hear me okay. I'm going to share a screen. I've got a few slides, and then I'll just give you a very quick look at Leap if I don't take too long over the slides, which I have a tendency to do. Hope you can see that slide. Yeah, so I just have a few slides here. Here we go. Yes, so, you know, I'm going to probably restate some of the things that you said, Rose, and apologies for that. But I think there's a big irony in energy demand modeling. You know, energy efficiency has been the most important tool that the world has been using for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and energy efficiency it's been the sort of the most effective tool as well. And energy efficiency is also key to helping helping achieve good energy policy, which is vital for promoting growth and for promoting development. And it's particularly important in countries that tend to be very dependent on oil imports, which is really many of the economies in Africa. So the demand side of energy is really sort of vitally important. But the irony is that it's really been neglected. Energy demand modeling has always been the very poor cousin of energy system modeling. Most modeling is still primarily supply oriented. It's very much focused on doing sort of least cost optimization of energy systems where the demand is more or less exogenously specified. I was thinking of doing a slide speculating why it is that it's been neglected. And I'm not sure that I have a definitive answer, but I think it's in part down to some of the reasons that Rose mentioned in passing. It's quite hard to do. There's the detailed data that you need to do demand modeling well is in very short supply. That data is very scarce, and it's particularly scarce in a lot of African countries. But I think it's also to do with the predilections of us modelers. Modelers they like to do what they know they can do well, which is focusing on algorithms. It's focusing on developing algorithms for optimizing energy systems, which is something that works really well on the supply side when you're thinking about electric generation expansion plans, but it's not quite so useful when you're thinking of the demand side, which is in some ways simpler, but in other ways fundamentally more complex, because it involves people a lot more. It's not just a technocratic question, but it involves thinking about what development futures you're interested in, which is obviously a very key issue. Aware that we're talking to a group here from Africa Energy Futures, and the demand side is really key to thinking about those futures. It's key to thinking about what sort of energy systems do you want to design for your countries in the future? And the demand side is really the driver of a lot of that. The supply side is just there to sort of provide you with the energy you need, but the demand side is all about the energy services, and it's thinking about what your needs are for your populations, and what your desires are as well in terms of what kind of economies you want to design for the future. So, why should we have a new focus on energy demand modeling? Well, maybe you could argue that it was justifiable to have a lack of focus on demand in the past. In the past, when energy systems were evolving more slowly, and maybe when we hadn't really recognized some of the crises that we're trying to address now. And by crises, I don't just mean climate change, but I mean the crisis of underdevelopment. These things tended to have a sort of lack of focus on them, but I don't think we can justify that neglect any longer. Now we're in a situation where energy systems, for better or worse, are evolving very rapidly. There's lots of new demands emerging. So, we're talking about electrifying our energy systems. There's whole new sectors of demands emerging. Data centers is the one that's sort of, data centers and AI is sort of the famous one. But there's lots of other things that are changing very rapidly socially, partly due to sort of the demands of the climate transition, but also due to sort of development imperatives as well. So, the need to transition the way that cooking is done, in Africa would be a really important one. Should we be transitioning? I think we should be transitioning as rapidly as we can towards clean cooking, and that probably means electrification, or at least means switching the fuels that we're using. These changes are going to happen very rapidly over the next couple of decades. And we're not just talking about changes in sort of total energy demands. You know, those changes with these new sectors emerging, these new fuels and new energy sources emerging, that will have a huge impact on both seasonal and diurnal shape of demand. So the demand side is important in and of itself, but it's also vitally it's going to have very far-reaching impacts on what the supply side needs to look like to meet those demands. Another really key issue for a lot of countries is that utilities are rapidly losing their highest paying customers due to the rapid growth of renewables behind the meter. And in the past, a lot of countries have tried to use their energy supply systems as a way of conducting social policy, you know, using cross subsidies to subsidize household energy consumption by asking industrial consumers to pay a bit more. That's going to be very difficult to do, and it's already causing a lot of problems in a lot of countries because those industrial customers are just opting out and using sort of behind the meter renewable energy. So all of these things have a lot of far-reaching implications for energy systems. But also from a more positive perspective, you know, energy efficiency and other policies and the need to study them by doing demand modeling, those things can have, you know, can significantly shape how all of these different trends are going to play out in future. You know, without demand modeling, you're not going to know where those trends are headed, but energy demand modeling is going to be absolutely vital for that. And I think, you know, a lot of these factors also really underline that we really require a strong role for government in energy planning, and that's why governments need to be doing a lot more energy demand modeling. So how do you do energy demand modeling? Well, it's traditionally been, as I said, it's been sort of largely or relatively neglected. It's often been conducted using top-down econometric or trend-based forecasting. That's really quite simple in principle. You know, you're basically looking at trends, or you're looking at sort of high-level economic variables, and you're looking at the correlation between the growth in demands and the change in those variables. Those kinds of approaches, though, I don't think they work anymore. Firstly, they're fatalistic. They assume that the future is only dependent on the evolution of those high-level variables. And in the long run, and we're talking about long-run analysis here, in the long run, it's almost impossible to predict those high-level variables anyway. You know, no one really knows what the price of oil is going to be in 2050. No one really knows what GDP growth rates are going to look like. And the reality is that alternative energy futures are possible. You know, we don't have to take a fatalistic approach, and those futures can largely be governed by the policy choices we make in the coming decades. And I think one of my favorite quotes on energy, well, I don't think it was made about energy, but it applies very well to energy, is that one way of thinking about forecasting the future is stated by Alan Kay, which is the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And I think that's sort of the role for energy demand modeling that we're talking about here, you know, exploring alternative energy futures, deciding which ones work well for a country, which ones don't, deciding which futures you like, and then using energy modeling in general and energy demand modeling to help plan how you're going to achieve those futures. And that's the best way to predict the future, is by actually doing the planning that will help to shape it. But doing that requires a different approach. It requires not doing top-down modeling, but it really requires bottom-up modeling. And that means it means you have to consider in detail all of the different sectors of your economy that use energy. You have to think about the end uses where energy is needed. And you have to think about all of the various alternative technologies that can potentially provide those energy services for each end use, and look at the pros and cons of those different technologies. But there's challenges in doing that. You know, bottom-up modeling can allow you to assess technology-oriented policies. It allows you to look at things like economic costs and benefits. It allows you to look at environmental, developmental, and energy security implications. but it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of requiring much more detailed data. You have to be prepared to manage a lot more data. You probably have to be able to collect more data that, in many cases is not readily available at the moment. So it implies that countries have to put a lot more effort into getting access to good quality data in their countries. Some of that data just isn't available at the moment. You can get access to it through surveys. Some of it is available, but it's proprietary, and it probably requires regulations to ensure that the governments can have access to data, particularly industrial data. But as some, you've probably heard this quote before by Peter Drucker, but you cannot manage what you don't measure. So unless you're prepared to start collecting more data, then it's going to be a challenge to do this kind of thing. Equally challenging is choosing the appropriate methods for how to simulate how these complex systems that you're going to model, how are those things going to change over time? And let me try and say a little bit more about that. I think I've missed a slide here. I'm sorry. I'll just say some words about it, but I think I've missed a slide. So, there's lots of different methods available. There's simulation methods. There's optimization methods. But I think the challenge in the demand sector is that one method isn't going to fit all different sectors, and you're going to have to be nimble and think about what sectors are appropriate given the different kinds of data you have available in different sectors. It's also an evolving process. You might want to start out, in fact, I would recommend that you start out in a fairly simple way, and it's okay to use simple methods, particularly if you're looking at smaller sectors or sectors that aren't growing very much. Then, maybe trend analysis and econometric methods are appropriate. But in other sectors where you've got important choices to make, then technologies like optimization modeling might be more appropriate. Optimization modeling can help you identify what might be sort of the least cost configuration of systems, but it's more complex to do. And then I think also worth mentioning is not all methods involve very complex algorithms. In a lot of countries, thinking about how systems might change over time, or thinking about what the potential technologies that make sense are, that can involve a lot of expert judgment. It can involve a lot of discussion with expert stakeholders in different industries, and you can get their views on what they think are possible, and you can embed that into your energy modeling. Not everything has to involve algorithms. A lot of the work is a sort of a process of working with stakeholders to review the models that you develop and to sort of ground truth them and see if the stakeholders think they're sensible. Let me say a little bit about also where demand and supply are connected. So, as we've got these very rapid transitions going on, as we're sort of transitioning to low greenhouse gas renewable-based supplies, for example, it's going to be increasingly important that demand and supply modeling are closely integrated. So traditionally, someone's done the demand modeling, they've handed over some numbers, and then the supply modelers have done their optimization modeling. I don't think that works anymore. I think they have to be much more closely integrated. So there's this issue of newly emerging demands. Those demands will have a huge impact, not just on the overall demands for electricity, but also on the shape of the electric load. And without large-scale deployment of energy efficiency, smart energy management, those kinds of technologies, it will be very hard to meet the growth in demand, while also, rapidly transitioning to clean energy systems and decarbonizing electricity supply. And demand modeling and demand-side management can be a major tool in helping you think about those things. So, if you can think about the potential for energy efficiency, that can buy space to do electrification of in other sectors. So thinking about the demand side, but you also have to think about the things on the supply side that connect to that. So things like energy storage and expanded grids. And design an overall system that works well together. And I think you really need to have the demand and supply modeling closely integrated to do that well. And there has to be sort of quick feedback between the two, and it's much more of an exploratory process rather than developing a single optimized system. So those are some of the challenges, but what does that imply for the kinds of modeling tools we should be using? So I think a few key points. I think energy demand modeling tools need to be flexible. They need to support diverse contexts. For example, they need to work well when data is scarce, but they also need to be powerful enough so they can be scaled up to look at very complex systems. The tools need to support multiple methods. And, I think it's no good having a model that just has one particular approach. If you want to look at the economy as a whole, then you're going to need available, a toolkit that has different methods that are available to you. So that probably means accounting methods, it means simulation methods, it means econometric methods, it means optimization methods, and you may want to use different methods to look at different sectors. And the tools need to work well and be more accessible. So most tools today tend to be really accessible only by very expert energy modelers. And I think that kind of siloing of expertise doesn't really work very well anymore. It's no good just having, the modelers who are, comfortable hacking away at source code. It's no good having them off in a separate room. You need everyone working together, and you need tools that are at least somewhat accessible to stakeholders and less technically minded experts and decision makers. And everyone needs to be able to sort of gather around these tools and see what they're saying and be able to suggest inputs to them, even if they're not the modelers themselves. I think the demand and supply side modeling needs to be closely integrated, so that you can very quickly see the implications of what you're doing on the supply side for the demand side and vice versa. And you really need tools that support robust planning. So I think in the old day, we used to do sort of optimization modeling where we say, what's the perfect organization of an energy system? What does the least cost energy system look like? That doesn't really work so well anymore. You need systems that are able to think about alternative futures and an alternative sort of think about how the alternative externalities of the system are going to play out. So, we need policies that work well if energy prices are high or energy prices are low, or we need tools that work well if there's high or low GDP growth. So it's not about finding a single optimum. It's about finding sort of a set of policies that are robust under different conditions. And that probably implies that the tools need to support stochastic modeling. So they need to look at the probabilities of things and support methods like Monte Carlo analysis. So let me just, how am I doing for time? I'm pretty rapidly running out of time, but let me say a little bit about the tool that we develop and how we've tried to address some of these challenges. And, it's a journey. I wouldn't say that we have addressed all of the challenges yet, but it's something we're working on. So the tool that we develop at SEI is called LEAP, the Low Emissions Analysis Platform. And it does have some features that address some of these challenges. So first of all, it has a very flexible data structure. So it allows you to look at all sorts of different energy systems. You can do complex modeling in it, you can do simple modeling in it, and you can do some sectors in a more sophisticated way and others in a simpler way. It has a very wide choice of methods available. You can do accounting, simulation, optimization, stock turnover modeling. It's an integrated energy modeling system, so it very closely integrates the demand side and the supply side. But it's also in itself it's an integrated development environment. So it's not just a set of algorithms; it's a full-blown decision support system that assists users in the whole process of creating models, finding and managing data, debugging models, maintaining models going forward, documenting models as well. So it's not just a set of source code. It's a full-blown integrated development environment. It has a very rich data definition language which makes it easy to create scenarios. So you can create, multitudes of alternative futures and use the tool to examine them and to compare those different scenarios and decide which scenarios you do or don't like. And it's all designed in a way that minimizes the need for data entry and simplifies the maintenance of models going forward. It has a very rich and user-friendly results visualization system. So it's really designed, and this is really a key point, it's designed to speak the language of energy planners and stakeholders first and foremost. It's not designed to be used just by modelers. It's designed to be used by people who maybe aren't full-time modelers, but people who are maybe like planners in energy and environment ministries. So it's something that's usable by people who aren't necessarily complete energy modeling nerds, as probably the group I'm speaking to are. It's also very extendable, so it has all sorts of ways of being extended to do additional things. So it has, for example, a capability to do air pollution planning, to look at sort of the health impacts of the air pollution caused by energy systems, or it has an API and a scripting system so that you can connect it to tools for doing Monte Carlo analysis and do sort of robust decision support planning. And then maybe the most important characteristic of all is that it's available at no charge to governments, NGOs, and academics in low and middle income countries and in most small line and developing states. And it's also available free to students worldwide. And that traditionally has been one of the reasons why many countries in Africa have chosen to use LEAP. It's been very widely used by energy ministries and environment ministries. We were just having a look at what countries have used it for the recent round of climate reporting, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and many countries in all parts of Africa, actually, northeast, south, west, have been using LEAP. Many of them, using it without much support, but some of them using it with support from other organisations. They've been using it to do their NDC planning. I'll show it to you in a second, but just to mention, if you'd like to get access to LEAP, it's available there at that URL, leap.sei.org. I'll post that in the chat in just a second. And please also think about joining us on the LEAP LinkedIn group. So that's just leap.sei.org/LinkedIn. And let me very quickly show you what it looks like. Have I got 5 minutes left, Rose? Is that okay?
Okay. I know that LEAP is a resource that so many African modelers use. So try and
Am I overrunning a bit?
So yeah.
Okay, I would promise no more than 5 minutes. I hope you can see my screen there. Just to give you a quick sense, this is what LEAP looks like. You can see it's a Windows based energy modeling system. It's very much oriented around a sort of a tree data structure, and it's not. What I'm showing you is the sort of the modeling software, and every model will look different in every country. So you can actually create and edit this tree structure to suit the conditions in your own country. This one here has quite a lot of detail under the household sector, but it's very simple in other sectors. You can create and edit that. Over here on the right is the place where you put the data in. You can see this kind of equations over there. That's where you're doing this sort of the describing sort of the trends in how variables change over time. There's a results view where you can see all sorts of different variables. So this is the results view. Here we're looking at some energy demand results. You can see it's organized by sector. It's very flexible. You can see it by subsector. You can see things as charts or as tables, or you can even dig down even further and look at sort of end uses and technologies. You can see not just sort of overall trends in demands, but you can also see, let me see if I can find one here. You can see what the sort of the shape of the demands looks like over time. So here we're looking at sort of the load shape over time and how that load shape is made up of the demands in different sectors. So here you can see sort of the load contributed by households, or if we go down another level, here you can see, this is how much load comes from air conditioning. But you can also create scenarios, so you can compare how different policies are going to affect these different things. Let me just very quickly show you that. So here's one where we're comparing the load shape of two different scenarios. So this is looking in the future at, say, 2050. So you can see here's a future where maybe we've done a lot of work on reducing of doing energy efficiency in the household sector, and we've reduced. Let me do one more level down. So there you go. So like here in our baseline, we have a lot of the peak is contributed by air conditioning. So we might want to do a policy where we do very efficient air conditioning. So therefore, a lot less of the peak is coming from the air conditioning, and we've avoided all of these. The thing in the white dotted lines, that's the sort of the peak load that we've avoided by doing our policies. And by doing that, you're making space for yourself to maybe do more electrification in the transport sector. So here's our sort of EVs, where we've got much more of those in this policy scenario than we do in our baseline. That's the sort of things you can compare. So that's what the demand side looks like, and then you can see, okay, well, how are we going to meet this load shape on the demand side? Well, then you can look under transformation and look at sort of the electricity generation down here. Let me just show you one down there. So here's like power generation, for example, over time. So how are we going to meet that load? Here we're doing sort of optimization modeling on the supply side to see how that matches the demand side. So here you can see there's different power plants being dispatched. Here's some energy storage. So it makes sense, in some hours of the year to put energy into your batteries, and some hours of the year to take the energy out of the batteries. That's the sort of thing that you can look at. And as I say, that the model is, it's really easy to look at the results in the model, and the model is really designed to speak the language of planners, not of modelers. You don't have to be a really expert modeler in order to dig quite deeply into how the system works. And I think I've overstayed my welcome. Sorry, I've taken too much time there. So I'll leave it at that, but just to give you a very, just a glimpse of the kinds of things you can do with the modeling tool itself. And okay, back to you, Rose.
Rose, you're on mute.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So thank you, Charlie, for that. I know there are going to be questions. I have some too, but I'll hold the questions for now and move on to our final speaker so we can do the Q&A all together. So I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Vijay Modi, who is, again, another long timer in the African energy space. I think if you've never encountered Vijay, then I don't even know if you live in Africa at this point. So Vijay, he's a professor at the Columbia Earth Institute, and he's been doing research on. He's a long history of doing electrification and rural electrification and energy access research for a long time. More recently, he's doing fascinating research on estimating rural and agricultural demand. And really showing how we are really badly underestimating the demand, especially focusing on this rural side that is often neglected. So Vijay, over to you to give a short presentation. Hopefully keep it to 10 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A. Sorry, thanks.
Okay, so I'll try my best, and it will be hard to follow Charlie with your really rich presentation. It's really just exactly 20 years that I first met a couple of my colleagues in a hotel in Ghana by chance, that I got into. I caught the Africa bug, so to speak, and it never left. So, and, I'll show a little bit of what research in the US is looking like. It's all based on data from sub-Saharan Africa, and hopefully this Africa Energy Future program changes that, right? So all the tools, data, protocols are at this link, and you can also email me. So I've recently focused on, as Rose said, on rural settings where both we don't know what the access challenge exactly is. We don't know if we meet the access challenge, what the demand will be, and what if we don't have certain provision, some kind of electricity, what it limits and what you can't do, right? And so I'm going to focus on that. There are lots of different research. Early research really relied on either census data to the degree it existed, through DHS, LSMS surveys, which were sample surveys. It would be 1,000, 3,000 households in a country of like 50 million people, so it was hard. There were biases. Then people tried to use night lights, where, the sort of interesting aspect of that emerged was, at low levels of consumption, it was very difficult to discriminate between, let's say, people using, 2 kilowatt hours or 5 or 10. At higher levels, it was better, but then a lot of reality ended up in that low level. So, it had its limitations. Then there were models connecting those remote sense data with other indicators and so on. Then only in the last 5-10 years, and I worked with eGuide Consortium and, worked very hard to sort of see if we could get samples of utility data, and there it is. And there's a lot of recent outputs from deep ML and all that. Ironically, we didn't even know exactly, and we have been engaged in that, what a household even is. Sometimes 4 structures are in a household, sometimes 1 is, and so on. So I'll give an example of that. So, this was some early work, lot of planning. This is from Kenya. And as you see, some declining consumptions based on when you connect it. And so it turned out that, utility experience was with urban, peri-urban customers or early rural. But if you then aggressively electrify, and this is from Rwanda, I'll show you that aggressive electrification into rural areas led to monthly consumptions that are really absurdly low, less than 5 units a month for the most. So this is highlighting that, first of all, why is Kenya different from Rwanda, right? One is, the recent ones consuming 5, another 15. We don't exactly fully understand that, right? And, this partly in Rwanda, like very aggressive electrification, right? So, we are just beginning to get a handle that if you try to, get very ahead, you may reach populations that can't afford it. So I think, then one quick snapshot of research on rural, we don't always know how many remote sense structures actually mean a household. So in this kind of middle part of Uganda, it's closer to 3 or 4, for example. So I wanted to just, there was a glimpse. I think we have missed some macro drivers in this space. What are the macro drivers between sort of countries? And showing you some data of rural incomes. This is World Bank has an indicator. And you see how, for example, Ethiopian statistics, the orange dot, show a continuous rise on the per worker added value. Uganda is kind of stable, Zambia is declining. How does that affect consumption? So we've been looking at that, and I think this is, to me, an interesting I'm interested in, is like, can we nail down for low income customers what the percentage of income that goes into electricity, for example? So this is, there are some biases in the data. If you correct, you get between 1 and 2%, right? How do you, when you do provide electricity, there's a wide variation, right? among the consumers. How do we look at that? So that's something really rich for locally doing this work. Then we did some work on informal settlements. I will skip that in the interest of time. We think of a connection as a connection, but we don't understand quality of connection. And in informal settlements, that's a big challenge. We are finding that spending levels are very high, but the service levels. So I think this is something might worth. Then just a few comments on agriculture. I think rural livelihoods are primarily agriculture, livestock driven. Of course, that can be some artisanal mining or a new industry locating there because of a natural resource. But by and large, so I think this understanding of demand and what, kind of latent or nascent demand, if looks like, I think is also an interesting area of research. So to let's look at a couple of those. So this was done by close to about 100 African Ugandan enumerators that we helped train. They used this tool called Kobo, which was Kobo was developed in my lab about 10 years ago for some work we did, and then it was completely open source and anybody can use it. So Kobo is maintaining it, which is fantastic. These red dots tell you the density of diesel machines in Uganda. You see that some parts are systematically high density, right? Blue dots are where those same machines are running on electric. It's really a tribute to the people who did all this, using motorcycles and all that. They collected 80,000 points at $10 a point. It turned out the Ugandan government said, wait a minute, it was cheaper than doing it with remote sensing, and with remote sensing, we got it wrong. So sometimes, you do have to go to the field. There's seasonality issues we are beginning to understand because energy service providers want to know that seasonality. Sometimes you can leverage natural experiments. If somebody is replacing diesel with electric, we can see how the demand is changing due to that. So that's another sort of interesting research tool. Irrigation, I think, is an understudied thing. Here's some snapshots from Zambia, completely missed as in demand. And if you look at this, the green dots are irrigation demands, blue dot are household, all planning, tools are focused on the household alone, and therefore they go to these yellow circles. But actually, the aggregate demand from these green dots is higher than that of the household demand. But since we didn't know about it, we didn't plan around it. Now, I'll skip some of the methods used to do it at scale. You can combine some ground truth with, leverage various satellite products to expand it. Main challenge we are trying to address is detecting smallholder irrigation. That's the hard part. Somebody is irrigating 5 hectare, 10 hectare. That's not hard. And this affects how you think about it. People wanted to know the clusters because clusters can share infrastructure. Utilization can be very seasonal. So this is a little bit on electric cooking that we are working on. I think this is also an interesting area where we found that low-cost appliances, how do they affect consumption? So, nowadays with smart metering, you can tell how much more and when more. So how do you, if you combine things, so I'm going to, maybe Rose, tell me, I can stop at any time,
Um, so yeah, I'm finding this extremely interesting. I have some questions as you go along. I think
I have a
maybe
couple of more minutes if you want.
yeah, please wrap up because I think
Yeah.
that
And
your the way the ground truthing, the pilots and field data, I have some questions about how this ties
Sure,
in with some of the modeling and whatever. So I
sure.
think please wrap up, and then
Yeah,
Steve will say
so
a few
this,
words, and then we'll do Q&A. But this is super, super fascinating because
yeah, so this is, how when you combine diverse loads, what does it mean for supply, right? So we have been looking at loads sometimes in isolation. So if I look at processing, households, load diversity changes load profiles, and that changes the cost of provision. And, just I am very excited to discuss not what I presented, but how, Rose, we can create a cadre of people who want to study this, and how do we marry this, if at all we think it should be, but this north-south interest, how do we do that? And I think that is where I would love to leave it at.
um,
And this nice animation was great. Continent, so I'll stop there.
all right. Thanks, Vijay. We lost you a bit, your connection at the end, but now you're back. Okay. Thank you, Vijay. So maybe let's all turn our videos on for the speakers. Steve, I'll let you say a few things, and then I'll open with a couple of questions. And please, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll integrate them in our discussion.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say to everyone, I did forget to introduce myself at the beginning. So I'm Steve Nichols, and I'm the Executive Director of Africa Energy Futures. But I wanted to just say a little bit how we constructed today's event. And Charlie mentioned in his talk that these modeling processes are fundamentally stakeholder processes. We have to bring policymakers and communities and businesses and a whole range of people along with these kinds of exercises. But it's incredibly difficult to do. It's incredibly difficult. Where do you start? How do you start having a conversation about industrial futures and industrial pathway options? What we've tried to do today is put together a sort of group of people who've been working on this and have got some open source tools that you can use. So, using Greenplexity, you can immediately start having a data-driven approach about what are potential industrial pathways. Using Plexos Leap, you can quickly get to where you can start thinking about integration. But also to make the point that a lot of the demand side estimates that we have are wildly off. And therefore our supply side studies are wildly off. So Vijay has made some really powerful points, and I had the privilege of spending more than an hour with him in his lab in the United States, and going through some of the studies and details, but showing that in some cases we're 4 times off. And so we're putting our infrastructure in the wrong places, and when we're thinking about energy access. So that was kind of the logic behind today. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but these are open source tools that are publicly available that you can kind of use to start thinking about some of these problems. Thanks, Rose. Back to you.
All right. Thanks, Steve. And thank you for convening these community discussions. I know you're very busy right now so Steve and his team received hundreds of applications for the first AEF Energy Modeling Hub. So they're very, very busy. So thanks for taking the time to convene this conversation on the side. Okay, so I think that one thing that is kind of cut across all 3 speakers is this like characterizing demand has to be done from the bottom up. So that came across, and everyone is doing it differently. So Ketan was trying to build a picture using trade data, market data, and playing around with value chain. Charlie, you're kind of doing this modeling that is taking into account technology costs, evolution, different calibrations within the model. And then Vijay, you're doing like so many creative mixed methods. You're doing pilots, field data, satellites, utility data, just again, trying to build a picture of how demand is moving on the ground, and especially in Vijay, in these rural communities where you're working. A question I have for both of you is, how do these, so for example, for Vijay, like this really on the ground truthing work you're doing with the pilots, field studies, satellite, you're using all these different data centers to characterize on the ground. How does that tie into these modeling conversations and vice versa? And then for Charlie, yeah, how is there any way that your work at Leap speaks to this kind of data and work that Vijay is doing, and or how are you kind of trying to ground truth the data that's going into your Leap modeling? So maybe start with Vijay, then go to Charlie.
So, Rose, I think the data we tried to gather was to provide options to either private sector or to the government. And so for that so I think it starts with that, right? What is it for? And then we didn't create sort of a very big software package.
Oh, Vijay, your connection is a little bit unstable suddenly.
But
Okay.
imagine,
You're back now. Okay.
let me cut my
Okay.
video.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, let me cut my video. I'm in India and it's a little bit challenging here. So we developed this, what I would almost call widgets. So they are like collab open source tools, which allow you to then synthesize those and run models for what energy system it may look like, what if it is standalone, what kind of storage to solar PV ratios would it need. Some are seasonal. So if you include seasonality, what does it mean for the cost of providing it? So I think I have taken in my lab more a sort of approach that do this tiny models, and then people can play with it, see how, what choices they can have. So it does kind of a little bit of what Homer does, a little bit of what Onset does, but at a local level, right? So that's the approach. And all those are on GitHub, they're on Python. Unfortunately, we do trainings, but they're not hugely well documented, but they are small enough. And the purpose for it is small enough so you can literally say, hey, here's the satellite image from Google or Bing or whatever it is, and it can help you convert to households, for example, because their ratios are different. So there's one for that. And then if you want to think about where transformers would be for grid or where mini grids, there's a small little tool for that. And then there'll be another tool that says, hey, but if I now add irrigation and processing, and I forgot to say, you could have processing demand even in a village that exceeds the entire household demand of that community, but you didn't know it existed, and that was difficult to figure out from remote sensing. So I don't know and then if, there are complementary times that they work, there's hardly any processing during certain season, and there's hardly any irrigation in some other season. So how do they complement if you want to create, a load profile? Anyway, over.
Yeah. Thanks, Vijay. So Charlie, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, on the question of calibrating models, I think maybe a really important point is that the more that we can make modeling not seem like such a siloed activity, something that's just done by these guys that we call modelers who sit off in their dark rooms doing their modeling in front of their computers. That's not the way to think about it. I think we got to think of that. The whole activity of energy planning has to be more of a process, and for sure, lots of models are wrong in lots of places. But the process of modeling in part is about improving the data, and the data is about improving the modeling. It's just very much a circular process, and one of the nice things about having data structured in a nice hierarchical way, the kind of way that it is in Leap, but also many other modeling tools, is that you can, run a first iteration of the models and say, this model seems to think that, the industrial sector is really bad, really big, but that doesn't seem right to me. So then you can use the models. You start with the best data you have, right? And my old PhD supervisor used to say to me, Charlie, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And what he meant by that was, you have important decisions to make, and the development of your country depends on the energy policy decisions you make. So you have to make those decisions sometimes based on bad data and bad modeling, but the modeling itself can help feedback and improve the data. So you can say, it seems this sector is really important, or it seems to be growing really fast. Let's design some targeted energy surveys to see if that's really true, and then you start creating these sort of beneficial circles. But what that implies, I think, is that the modeling itself has to be much more open to a much broader group of people. And that's what we've been trying to do with LEAP is, make a tool that's usable by thousands of people instead of by just 10 modelers in a country. You want the planners in the country to know what's going on with it. You want the stakeholders to know what's going on with it. So the more that you can have a bigger group of people looking over each other's shoulders and saying, that number doesn't look right, that's a really beneficial thing, right? Because then you can start to have discussions. And I know that's happening in some countries. Like, I know Ghana, for example, they have multi-ministerial meetings where they actually look at the software together and they compare the numbers and they think about whether the policies make sense. So I think those kind of the sort of the process around it being more open is really important.
Great. Okay, I'll ask one more question before I turn to some of the questions that are in the Q&A. So Vijay, one of the things I'd wanted to ask you about going into this was about how we misestimate and rural demand, especially. And in your presentation, actually, I thought I was assuming the story there is that we are underestimating. We're not capturing all of these loads that are not kind of more formal. But actually, your data is showing that, like, actually, a lot of the rural demand is quite low. There's very low growth, low affordability. So for me, that story was surprising. So just a little bit more about this misestimation.
We are both under and overestimating.
Okay.
We are overestimating sometimes
maybe cut the video again because you were frozen. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
We are sometimes overestimating household demand, and we are underestimating non-household demand. So that's one. I don't know if that came across. Right? So I think there is both under and over. I think the biggest research challenge I see, Rose, is we don't understand properly the link between energy and poverty. And poverty impacts affordability and therefore the energy demand. So we are doing some work for India to take different districts where different interventions were done. And we see that where interventions in agriculture were done, 7 years later, the electricity demand was much higher. Now, why 7 years? Because we only had data from 7 years later. We didn't have it for every year. Right? So I think from a research perspective, I think one big missing piece here is, what all ingredients are needed for, and what role among those ingredients, among those suite of, sort of development issues, there are programs Ethiopia has done, which really, like I showed the data. We need to look at successes and try to unpack what it took as well. So over.
Okay, thanks, Vijay. So, Charlie, I see you're typing in response to Yusuf's question, but maybe you can just respond to it here about how LEAP can help Nigerian policymakers plan and model, and maybe you can kind of broaden even beyond Nigeria. And while you're at it, and then maybe follow up with a question about how your decision tree structure can align with the type of data that Vijay collects. And there's Yusuf, I see there's a question here for Ketan. We'll pass that over to him via email, but and hopefully we'll get an answer. So Charlie, hopefully you can kind of in a condensed way address both, and then
Yeah, I'll try and keep it condensed. No, I think having these sort of energy system models, there's a lot of work involved in developing version one of them, right? You want a model that, covers all of the sectors of your economy and gives you a reasonable picture of where energy comes from and goes to. But once you've done that, once you've got a reasonable um, 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 a base model, then you've got a foundation for you, and you can use that as a lab for testing out these different policies you're interested in. So, and I think that speaks to the second question as well. Once you've got a decent overall model of the whole system, then you've got a foundational lab, and then you can start testing out policies. So, for example, you could say, if we thought about all these energy efficiency policies in Nigeria, if we put those all in place, how much is that going to reduce energy consumption? How much is it going to change the shape of the the end of the load shape? And what might that mean for our ability to decarbonize or our ability to become more energy independent? Those kinds of things. So it's a sort of a baseline lab that you can then use to test out all sorts of different policies.
Thanks, Charlie. Steve, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on Yusuf's question as well. I know Keaton's not here, but when we think about these industrial futures and the industrial strategies, and Rose mentioned this earlier, typically what I see in country level studies across Africa is this big bet approach. Oh, we're going to do data centers. Oh, we're going to do electric vehicles. We're going to do hydrogen. So I saw one study for an East African country where of the projected 12 gigawatts of demand, 6 were from hydrogen electrolyzers and data centers. And so the nature of that grid is super difficult to model for. You've got these big load points. You could potentially huge fluctuations in demand. And so even your supply side is going to be compromised. And in reality, that's probably not how that economy would grow. And so we miss this discussion about what does our broader light and heavy industrial base look like over time. And in fact, that's a much more stable job predicting kind of way to think about this. But of course, it's not certain. So any economy is taking bets. And this is why kind of Charlie talks about, well, shouldn't we do Monte Carlo simulations? Like how likely is this future? And you start to build up an understanding of what energy strategies are robust across different types of future economies. And the tool that Harvard have put together help us think through what is a more likely industrial strategy versus another. So is Nigeria much more likely to be competitive at clusters of things that they already have capability in? Of course they are. But as Ketan said, that doesn't mean you don't do the sort of bigger bet kind of things, but you have a sort of balanced portfolio. And that is challenging for governments because they like certainty. They're not used to managing a portfolio of risk, And so alongside all of this modeling change is a culture change that we have to get our heads around. Thank you.
So I have one question to close, then I'll hand over to Steve. I think we'll end early. Before I ask my final question to both panelists, I just want to acknowledge that Lebo said in the Q&A, I think the point that underscores this whole conversation that real energy demand data and getting a handle on that is the starting point. So Lebo, thanks for reinforcing that. That's like really the very reason we're having this conversation. So you're very, very right there. Okay. So final question for Charlie and Vijay, both of you take it. And this points one to the point, Vijay, you raised about kind of capacity, which we misuse that word, but how can we kind of strengthen the ranks of African experts, modelers, practitioners who are using these tools, conversant in these tools, contributing to data and ideas, and just kind of part of this kind of community of people grappling and contributing to this energy demand and energy modeling question. So both of you have worked for decades across the continent, across the world. You've done, I'm sure, your fair share of trainings. You've collaborated with lots of people. So I'd just love to hear your brief thoughts on what you think we've got right, what we've got wrong, and how can we get past this kind of short-term one-off training cycle to really start building that deep capacity, which is also at the heart of what AEF is trying to accomplish as well. Related to that, you two not only have worked with experts for many years doing kind of capacity building in different various forms, you've also worked across the world, global north, global south, Asia, Africa, all over North America. And so I would love to hear a little bit about kind of, especially in the South-South learning, but just kind of global learning, like how we can kind of strengthen learning. So I think Vijay, you know, in your presentation, you have pointed to India going back and forth, and both of you have experience working and doing modeling all over the world. And so how can we leverage these global learnings, especially in the South-South? So two-part closing questions. Try and keep it brief. I know it's a bit big. Just kind of like your 1, 2, 3 thoughts based on your decades of kind of being on the ground. So maybe I'll start
Charlie,
with
go
Vijay,
first.
and then yeah.
Or maybe Charlie, you go first.
Okay, Charlie, go first. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, it's a very big question. It's very, very hard to answer in a short amount of time. Maybe one thing I would say is, yes, thanks for keeping reminding me. I have been doing it for decades.
Sorry to remind you that you're old.
yeah, but the good side of that is that you know, even though things seem like a huge challenge now, and you know, when we talk about capacity building, quite often it can be capacity rebuilding. I find a lot of the projects we do, you know, there's this well-known, you know, cliche story about how, you know, you build up capacity and then all the people leave the institution, then you have to rebuild it all over again. That's well known. But things are way better. You know, things have really advanced in major ways. So even if things sometimes seem a bit difficult, you know, things are really, there's a lot of positive stuff going on, and there's a huge amount of capacity now in Africa and in lots of other places. But I do think that, you know, one of the ways that we can contribute to that are to help foster communities of practice where people are learning from each other much more. We've been trying to work on that as best we can around the software, but also to make the tools much more accessible. So a lot of the tools that are around today are really only accessible to modelers, and there's only ever going to be a small number of people that can use those tools. So you really are, you know, if those are the tools that we give people to use, then you are always going to be doing capacity building, because there's never going to be more than a handful of people in any one country who can use them, and it's very hard to keep maintaining that. But if we can make the tools much easier to use and much more accessible to a much broader audience, then you've got the potential for something to really sort of catch fire. And I think that's kind of happening a bit. You know, you're seeing a sort of explosion of people who can do this kind of modeling. They used to say about marathons that was only a few hundred people in the world that can run a marathon. It turns out that's wrong. It turns out that there's hundreds of thousands of people who can actually run a marathon. Not me, but lots of other people. But I think the same could be true of energy modeling. You know, I think we can get vastly more people involved.
I see. As a Kenyan, I hope it doesn't diminish our competitive edge if everyone is running marathons.
Well, that's true.
Okay. All right. Great. Vijay, over to you.
So I'm biased, Rose, because I'm in academia, but I feel that academia could take on research questions, modeling questions, data questions, which are somewhat like you can't deliver in 3 months. You know, it may take like a year, 2 years to answer some questions. And I think it would be, to me, there are so many talented people that I am encountering who can do this. They just, need a kind of quote unquote space, whether somewhere to do it. Where I have landed, Rose, is that I think we need to leverage that talent in situ, like without taking them out of their job. Okay. So if they are working with a utility, they are working with a think tank, they are working with an NGO or a bilateral thing, they are working in policy. Let's leverage that deep knowledge of the domain and then do issues of modeling, options, data with them. And I think we will get to now. So that's one point. Other point is, I think we do really need to make a case for strengthening research universities. Like actually they were there, but it declined. We need to re-strengthen, so to speak, within the university system, so that there is a sort of there is a kind of regenerative, circular model to train new people. So those are my two short comments. Let's figure out a way to get people to the level they can actually join faculty, and get universities to create space to allow those faculty to do research within their own country, region, or outside. Doesn't matter, just like I did. So over. Rose.
I like that. And to be able to integrate practitioners.
Yes.
But using the university as a launch pad that reaches outwards, and then from Charlie, what I had is these communities of practice that kind of integrate all of these people, and create this living, breathing, active community. So thank you both, and also Ketan, who is not with us. This has been such a stimulating conversation. I've learned so much. We have many requests for slides, LinkedIn's, everything. So Steve, I know you'll follow up afterwards, but and thank you to everyone who's been with us for this entire conversation. So over to you, Steve.
Yeah, it remains for me to thank Rose and the speakers, Charlie and Vijay, who are here. A fantastic session. It was really interesting, and also just highlights a lot of what we're trying to do at Africa Energy Futures. So, both made the point that we have these skills in Africa. We just don't have institutional homes for them. We don't have the communities of practice that they can learn from each other and start to build these skills. And so a lot of what we're trying to do at AEF is to do that. So we just closed our first call for proposals to fund research hubs in universities, so that you create these institutional homes. These meetings will carry on. We will have them regularly. We're calling them our community sessions. And the idea is to try to help you get familiar with the tools, but also to understand from you where you would like further support. So please do either drop in the chat or feel free to send us a mail on the kinds of areas you would like to do future sessions on. We'd love this to be demand-led, and we will have these regularly and start to build out these kinds of communities. So thank you very much to the audience for participating. The presentations and the recording of this event will go onto our website. We're just modifying our website to host sort of more events. So it'll probably take us a couple of days, but if you give us a few days, this will all be online, and you can have a look at it again. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you again, Rose and Charlie and Vijay.
Thank you.